So my thesis is that the War Convention is at least partly a convention. Let's say by the War Convention, taking from Michael Walzer's book, the definition, the set of articulated norms, customs, professional codes, legal precepts, religious and philosophical principles, and reciprocal arrangements that shape our judgments of military conduct and which are most explicitly set forth in positive international law. That's the War Convention. I want to talk about what seems to me the two most fundamental tenets of the War Convention, which have gotten a lot of discussion already here and elsewhere in the modern just war literature. That is the moral equality of combatants. That's the first tenet, that soldiers, or combatants anyway, I'll use them probably interchangeably, have an equal right to kill each other and have equally lost the right not to kill. That's the first tenet of the War Convention. And the second is the principle of non-combatant immunity, that the idea that there's a morally important distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Combatants may be killed, but non-combatants may not be killed intentionally. So these are the two tenets of the War Convention, and I want to defend both of these as against some critics. We'll talk about them momentarily. But I want to argue that they are partly conventional. So specifically, I want to say that and this is, if you were to guess which one of these is, one of these is conventional, either the moral equality of combatants or non-combatant immunity, which of them is conventional, you might guess the opposite of what I'm going to say. I'm going to argue that the moral equality of combatants is not conventional, but not the principle of non-combatant immunity is, I think, partly conventional. Of course, the question is, what do you mean by a convention? And I'm going to have to say a little more about that. Turns out it's not so easy to say, we're constantly saying, oh, that's conventional. That's not whatever the opposite of conventional is. And we take it that it's simple to say what a convention is, but it's not that simple, and there are different views of what a convention is. I'll say more about this later on, but we'll say in the meantime that to say that something is a convention is to say that it doesn't reflect a deep moral truth about things. So the paradigm case that's always given is, whether we drive on the left or the right is a convention. Doesn't matter which we do. It's indifferent. It's morally indifferent which we do. It's only important that we do one or the other. Or as Quine says in the preface to David Lewis's convention, we could have used the word big to mean small and vice versa. It's just a convention that the word big means big and small means small. There's more to be said about that. Okay, so recently these two tenets of the War Convention have come under fire. The moral equality of combatants is interesting. It seems I never really thought about it as something controversial, and I think even in Michael Walzer's book, he takes it almost for granted. I mean, he quotes Vittoria, who says, if the subjects cannot serve in the war except they are first satisfied of its justice, the state would fall into grave peril. And he doesn't say much more about it than that. So the moral equality of combatants, I think until, as far as I know, in the modern era, I'm sure, somebody in the 14th century, well, Vittoria at least, have raised the question, but in the modern era, it's David Roden and Jeff McMahon who have brought the criticism of this doctrine into the forefront. Principle of non-combatant immunity has often been questioned, and the whole issue of supreme emergency, which we heard about this morning and we'll hear more about tomorrow, I think, raises the question. So that has been more discussed even before the last few years. So I'm going to argue that moral equality of combatants is not conventional, essentially, and that non-combatant immunity is conventional. I think, two ways of going about it have dominated. One, again, exemplified by David and Jeff McMahon, focuses on sort of moral responsibility, innocence, and guilt. So that McMahon and Roden say that you can only target those who are morally responsible for unjust threats. There are, of course, levels of responsibility, but the conclusion is basically, their conclusion is that unjust combatants do not have the right to kill, and that just combatants may rightly kill non-combatants only when they are responsible for creating unjust threats. So that's one view, the view that focuses on moral responsibility and innocence and guilt. The other view is more permissive and focuses on threats that aren't necessarily morally responsible threats. So this is the view that allows you to kill, let's say, in self-defense, even innocent threats, even threats who aren't morally responsible, may be killed in self-defense. Now, in both these theories about when killing is justified, I think the idea of a threat obviously plays a very big role, and it plays a big role in just war theory everywhere. And it seems to me that a lot more needs to be said. There are a lot of ambiguities in the notion of a threat. I'm not going to say much about that, but just to point out three areas of vagueness or confusion that I think will become relevant later. First is the question, threats to what? Is it may you only defend yourself against a threat to your life? We sometimes get the feeling in discussions of justified killing in war or elsewhere that it's only to defend your life or to defend people's lives that killing may be justified. But it's pretty clear that many wars are fought, and even wars that we think are just wars, it seems, where it's not life itself, but it's a way of life, or it's somebody else's life. So that's humanitarian intervention. So humanitarian intervention is not self-defense. Defense of a way of life is not defense of life itself. I'm not taking a stand on this view. I'm not just suggesting that the conduct of actors on the international scene suggests that the common suggestion that killing is only justified in self-defense is too narrow. The second point about the ambiguity of the idea of threats is what we might call the difference. I think it was Jeremy Waldron who makes this distinction between micro versus macro threats. In the micro case, a combatant's life might be threatened on the battlefield or in some other war-related arena by other combatants. The macro threat, a combatant is representing a collective, for example, a nation whose existence or way of life is threatened. And if we think that you may attack the combatant who is representing that collective, it may not be that the combatant is himself a micro threat to, let's say, your life, but he's representing a collective that is a threat to your collective. The third confusion, I think, in the notion of a threat is that we imagine when we think of a threat as something active, palpable, positive, something that's sort of coming at you, coming to knock you down, threatening to destroy you in some way. But if we accept that threats may be not only to life but to ways of life, and that threats can be not only micro threats to an individual but macro threats in which combatants represent larger entities, then the manner in which other human beings can constitute threats, can sort of stand in the way of your victory is less straightforward. They need not be overtly or violently, they need not act overtly or violently to constitute threats. So I think this whole discussion of the theory of justified killing needs to make the idea of a threat much more clear. But in any case, I was in the process of saying that I think there are two ways to go about proceeding here, trying to figure out what the rules of just war should be. And the first is to develop a theory of justified killing, and I think that's the approach that David Roden and Jeff McMahon have taken. The alternative approach, I think, begins very differently with a recognition that wars are not ending anytime soon, and that instead of thinking our way up and out of fundamental principles about when a person is morally liable to be attacked or killed, we really have to begin with the recognition that wars are happening, they're going to happen willy-nilly, and try to figure out what kinds of rules are plausible in this context. Try to establish some rules, rights, and obligations that will constrain the violence of war. So the idea here is that we need morality, we need principles for the place that we find ourselves here and now. And there have been several eloquent articulations of this way of approaching the subject. Henry Shue said, war is not like peace. Seth Lazar said, just war theory is predicated on partial compliance. Michael Walzer, who says, what Jeff McMahon means to provide is a careful and precise account of what individual responsibility in war would be like if war were a peacetime activity. Henry Shue, we need a morality of war that deals with the extraordinary mass violence of war. And so of these two approaches, I put myself in the second camp, that we have to start with the recognition that wars are going to happen, that rights are being violated right and left, and that the main question is how can we reduce the carnage, the horrors of war, how that, given that war inevitably involves the violation of human rights and the defilement of human values, how can we rein in this awfulness? So this is the way I want to go, and before going further, let me just consider two possible objections to this approach. One is that, is there a danger that this approach is too forgiving? If we take for granted that, that war is horrible and war will inevitably involve the violation of human rights, haven't we already somehow given up on morality? And I think the answer is, it depends on what you mean by morality, for one thing. I think there is a danger of ethics becoming hostage to reality and perhaps going too easy on the parties involved, but I think it's a danger that we have to confront as best we can. So we can agree that, for example, that human beings have certain fundamental rights and that morality is not simply a matter of weighing costs and benefits. Enough tiny benefits for many people don't necessarily outweigh great costs for a few. So in that sense, it's not necessarily utilitarian. On the other hand, a deontological purist would reject this approach, perhaps, would say that an agent may not violate rights, even if overall rights violations are greater than if she did. By contrast, the approach I'm suggesting here says that we have to be concerned with how to produce the best situation, or more accurately, the least bad situation overall. So we can't be deontological purists. Okay, so I'm asking two questions. First, whether we should accept the two central tenets of the War Convention, moral equality of combatants and non-combatant immunity. We could, of course, accept one and reject the other. And second, if we accept them, on what basis should we accept them? Do either or both of them have a conventional component? So let me take each one in turn. First, the moral equality of combatants. So I've ever since I first heard of Jeff McMahon and David Roden's views about this, I've found their view deeply troubling, the rejection of moral equality. And other people have written very well on this question. So why do I think their view is wrong? First, because it's impossible to put in practice, and I think there are two main reasons for that. One is that most soldiers everywhere, rightly or wrongly, will think their cause is just, that they're fighting in a just war, and so it's hard to see how the rejection of the moral equality thesis can have any real effect in the world. And second, as others have argued as well, the rule that soldiers may only target enemy soldiers who are morally responsible for the threats they pose would require an ability to discriminate among enemy soldiers that's impossible in wartime. Since ought implies can, we have to reject this rule or else say that war is morally indefensible. If it's impossible to make the kinds of discriminations that would be required for soldiers to fight justly, then we either have to become pacifists or reject the rule. And Seth Lazar has argued this, arguing a more complex view that McMahon is committed either to saying that we have to be pacifists, or else if he lowers the bar of moral responsibility, then he gets rid of non-combatant immunity. In any case, these reasons, I think it can be said, are practical reasons. So we might still think, well, in theory, asymmetry may be the right view, but we can't put it into practice in the real world where wars take place, and that's why in the real world, we need rules, fairly hard and fast rules for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate targets and for regulating the conduct of all combatants, even though it may not precisely correspond with the rules we'd adopt if we had full information. But these are, you might say, practical reasons for accepting moral equality. And I must say I'm becoming increasingly suspicious of the distinction between theoretical and practical reasons, and I'm not even sure I can draw it anymore, but insofar as I can draw it, I think there are also theoretical reasons for accepting moral equality and rejecting asymmetry. And that's, I think, the moral distinction that's presupposed between just and unjust combatants by those who reject moral equality is wrong. And it's wrong because I think that in a very important sense, which I'm not spelling out here sufficiently, soldiers, even so-called unjust soldiers, but also just soldiers, are in general not morally responsible or liable for their situations in the way they would have to be for them not to have the rights that just combatants have. Okay, so unjust combatants are not in general morally responsible for their situations in the way they would have to be for them not to have the rights that just combatants have. And basically my view, which will also explain my views about non-combatant immunity, is that really soldiers are like the rest of us, only less fortunate. And this is certainly true of the ordinary soldier, less true as you go higher up the chain, but ordinary soldiers tend to be less fortunate than many of us. They tend to be poorer, less educated, with fewer options for advancement than others in their society. And in fact, it seems to me that unjust combatants, as opposed to combatants fighting a just war, are perhaps on the whole even less responsible for the wars they fight and the situations in which they find themselves than just combatants. They're more likely to live in undemocratic societies where they have less voice about public policy and government actions. They're more likely to be deprived of good information about the circumstances of conflict and war. And they're more likely to be coerced into military service and be threatened with serious consequences if they disobey. Now, so the second question about this doctrine, so is this aspect of the war convention a convention? I don't think it is, because the rule, the moral equality of combatants, rests on what I think of as central moral facts about combatants. That is, that in general they're no more responsible than the rest of us. They're less fortunate than the rest of us. And it reflects what I think is the correct moral conclusion, that just and unjust combatants are not, morally speaking, very different. And if we ask, can we imagine a different rule that would not do violence to the moral truth about these matters, that is, in other words, some version of moral inequality, I think the answer in general is no. The moral equality of combatants accords with the truth about the moral responsibility of combatants, whether just or unjust. Okay, what about non-combatant immunity? By contrast, and perhaps counterintuitively, I think the rule against targeting non-combatants does contain a conventional component. And here I'm very much under the influence still of the article by George Mavrodes in 1975 called Conventions in the Morality of War, which I just always found very persuasive and still do. He says, imagine a political leader reflecting on the costs of war in terms of human life and suffering. And he comes upon the idea, suppose we could just replace war with a less costly substitute, single combat between two volunteers, one on each side. And they're going to have a boxing match or whatever, and whoever wins the boxing match, that side wins the war. Of course, you might think, well, this is a very attractive prospect. It would be great if we could replace war with this kind of single combat. But of course, this particular example happens to be unrealistic. The parties in question, the nations in question, would be unlikely to abide by the results of the match between these two single individuals. But as Mavrodes argues, warfare between armies and limited to attacks on armies is a kind of expanded or modified version of this idea, a form of limited combat designed to reduce the carnage of war, and that can work and it sort of has worked reasonably well. Now, to figure out in what sense is this a convention? In one sense it seems quite clear it's a practice designed to reduce the carnage of war. Let me say a little bit more now about what a convention might be. Mavrodes says it's a rule whose validity derives, at least in part, from the laws and customs in place. And he gives as an example of a non-conventional rule, the rule against wantonly murdering your neighbors. That doesn't depend on any laws or conventions. That would be wrong in any situation. But by contrast, the rule against targeting non-combatants, he wants to say, is conventional. So what's the argument for the conventionality of non-combatant immunity here? I think there are a couple of important premises. I mean, the first begins with the difficulty of drawing the line between combatants and non-combatants. This is usually taken to be a matter of borderline cases and gray areas, but as I've been arguing, I think it's more than that. It rests on the idea that soldiers are really like the rest of us, only unluckier. So that this view underlies my belief in the moral equality of combatants, but it also underlies my rejection of non-combatant immunity as a fundamental moral principle. Non-combatant immunity is instead a convention designed to limit the horrors of war. I think under these very restricted circumstances and consistent with proportionality and perhaps some other basic moral principles, you may do what is militarily necessary for victory. I mean, I think the fact that we argue so much about examples of supreme emergency show that I shouldn't say most, but many people are willing to breach the principle of non-combatant immunity when it's absolutely necessary, when there's something overriding at stake. But in almost all circumstances, targeting non-combatants, or even killing them in large numbers, not directly but foreseeably, opens up the possibility of total war and greater carnage. So we accept the convention almost, and should accept the convention almost all of the time. It's what Jeremy Waldron calls a deadly serious convention. To say it's a convention is not to say it's unimportant. And again, here we come back to the complexity of defining a convention. Quine says the keynote of conventionality is a certain indifference. The syllable big could have meant small for all we care, and the red light could have meant go, and black ties could have been counted less formal than fancy ones. I mean, in this sense, almost nothing to do with war could be a convention, because, of course, we have to have reasons for accepting a particular convention, and the reasons in war can never be trivial or indifferent. We accept the convention if and when we do in order to reduce the horrors of war. How am I doing on time?
You have something like 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. So what is it that I mean to say when I say it's a convention? Again, I think I go back to what I said earlier on. It's a convention because it doesn't reflect a deep moral truth. In this case, a deep moral truth about the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. It's, again, taking Mavrodi's example, I think it's very apropos that instead of single combat, we have armies. But these are stand-ins, and they are not in significant ways morally different from ordinary people. So to summarize before making one final point, the two central tenets of the War Convention, I'm defending them both, the moral equality of combatants and non-combatant immunity. I'm arguing that the moral equality is not conventional because it reflects deeper moral facts about the equal culpability or lack of it of soldiers on both sides. And that same underlying principle is what makes non-combatant immunity conventional, because I think there's a similar lack of moral responsibility at some deep level between combatants and non-combatants, and we accept the convention as a way of preventing all-out total war. So let me just end with a paradox which I really don't know how to resolve, and which those who reject the moral equality of combatants don't face. So this is a problem for a view like mine, but I don't see any way out, really. I mean, I don't want to reject the moral equality of combatants, but I find myself faced with this paradox. Although moral equality is right and even unjust combatants are justified or excused for fighting, at the same time I think we want soldiers and would-be soldiers to consider deeply and carefully whether the wars they fight are just and act accordingly. So we hope that before they enter the military, if they have a choice, and once in the military, that soldiers take seriously the responsibility to evaluate the justice of their country's cause and the orders that they are asked to carry out. This is, of course, very difficult in many ways. You think of in the U.S., which has an all-volunteer army, so nobody has to sign up, but people do sign up, and sometimes, well, it's becoming less true that people sign up in peacetime, since we haven't had peacetime in 7 or 8 years. But, you know, if you imagine a soldier who signs up in peacetime before there is a war, there is no war to evaluate, and then war happens, the stakes are high for a soldier who resists engagement, and of course even more so for soldiers who are drafted, and even more so for soldiers who are drafted in undemocratic societies. So even though soldiers are no more responsible than other citizens, it's important for prospective soldiers to evaluate the justice of their side. And I think this just goes to, what seems to me, a fundamental principle that all human beings are responsible for evaluating the justice of their causes and for deciding what's right. And so, yes, we want every human being and every soldier to make those judgments and not to blindly obey orders, even legal orders. And I don't really know how to reconcile this fundamental moral fact with the moral equality of soldiers, but it seems to me that both these views are right, that we have some kind of fundamental existential duty to do what we think is right, but on the one hand, that's difficult to reconcile with the kind of order and obedience that a military requires. And if you think that a military is a justifiable institution, then you also have to think that it is important that there be orders obeyed and that not every order be questioned. So I don't really have an answer to this question of how you reconcile the two. I mean, we can talk, I want to talk about role morality. I want to talk about the distinction between the collective and the individual, perhaps about the first-person point of view versus the third-person point of view, and how from the first-person point of view, you as an agent must always do what you think is the right thing to do, of course taking into account the consequences of disobedience and all that. But nevertheless, there's still a paradox that remains, and maybe I'll stop with that paradox and hope someone can show me a way out. Thank you.
Thank you very much.